Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio Lunchtime Talk. So these talks are live every Friday at 1 p.m. here in the building and live online. Hello, online. So whether you're in Bristol or you're far away, you can join in the conversation. My name is Martin O'Leary. I am the studio community lead here. I'm a white man in my, at this point, very late 30s with long hair and a beard. And every Friday, we throw open the doors of the Pervasive Media Studio for Open Studio Friday, where we offer you the chance to spend some time in the space by hot desking alongside our residents and staff from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. So an especially big welcome to those of you who are new to the studio. Anyone new to the studio going to put their hand in the air? Welcome. Oh, okay, there's more than one of you. It's not just weird that I'm talking just to you. What is the Pervasive Media Studio? We're a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology, everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. And we're a partnership between Watershed, where we are right now, the University of the West of England, and the University of Bristol, and we're funded by Arts Council England. And what we do is we offer a studio space with desks, meeting rooms, events, and opportunities, all for free to our residents as part of a spirit of generosity and mutual exchange. And we're a place for people to take risks with embryonic ideas and to make some time for collaboration. So, quick bit of housekeeping. Please do feel free to move around, go to the kitchen, make a cup of tea, get a glass of water. There's some coffee in the pot. Don't use the microwave if you can help it. It interferes with stuff. We have a quiet space just through left, there's that door over there, your right, my left. If you need to take a break at any point, just pop in there, that's fine. Fire exits, we're not expecting a fire alarm. If you hear one, probably real. The studio team will direct you, but the fire exits are at the other end of the building, at the other end of the studio on either side. And there are accessible toilets and baby change in the corridor just over there next to the kitchen. There will be a Q&A at the end of the talk. So if you're watching online, please pop your questions into the YouTube chat. Emma is here today. She will be your voice in the room. And if you're in the building, you just stick your hand up and we'll send a microphone around. You can get news on all of our future talks by heading to watershed.co.uk/studio, at PM Studio UK on Twitter, at Pervasive Media Studio at mastodon.social on Mastodon, and at Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram. So next week will be the last talk of the summer. We take a little break in August. We'll be back in September, and those talks should be starting to go live fairly soon on the website, so you can check those out. There's some great stuff coming out. Anyway, our speaker for today is Michael Armstrong. They're going to be talking about the work they've done with Maxine Glancy at BBC R&D, looking at the role of the audience across a wide range of media and the challenges we face every time a new technology disrupts the relationship with the audience. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Michael.
Thank you. I've just realised something that I first visited Watershed just after it had opened in 1984, and I've been in the BBC 2 months short of the length of Watershed's existence. And you're about the same age as Watershed, obviously.
Yes.
I joined the BBC 40 years ago as an engineer because being an engineer was the easy way to get into the BBC. I have a family engineering and arts background. One of the things about Watershed, I first came here in '84 to do the Avon Schools quiz, and I have to say the vegetarian option is way better than it was then. I was working at Radio Bristol then on attachment, came back in the 90s and joined BBC R&D in 1999, so moved away from Bristol then. My research has been, in the past 24 years or so, has been at the point where sort of technology and humans collide and the interesting things that happen at that interface, from perception of sign language to picture quality, can you hear the words in your TV drama, and more latterly, structures of stories and things like that. This work I'm going to talk about came about because we'd focused on the problems that arise when people started to make interactive content. Oh, stuff you can interact with. And then we went, did that work? Something wrong there. Can't work it out. It formed part of our contribution to Bristol and Bath Creative Cluster work, specifically the Amplified Publishing theme, which started just as lockdown hit, which made it really easy to collaborate from London, Bristol and Manchester all together. this is where the slides are not going to run. Excuse me, this is... Okay, so my collaborator or co-conspirator, Maxine, joined R&D shortly after I did, working on digital design, and then moved to R&D. Maxine's worked on loads of different projects with collaborating with universities and various organisations, including one, Archive in Your Pocket, Wild Eye, Bristol University, and more recently, Virtual Realities, University of the West of England, so known to quite a few people with it in and around the studio. Currently looking at object-based, new production formats, immersed reality, interactive storytelling, mixed experiences. Maxine has at least 3 degrees and is currently writing up a PhD exploring XR media, OBM experiences. As a co-author, it's great. I asked for a page, I get about 7. So at least I've got lots of material to go on. We were thrown together to sort of sort stuff out in terms of look through our archive of all of this previous work that Maxine had done, and we've since gone a bit rogue and done lots of new things.
What's OBM?
Object-based media, so media that is made of lots of pieces which are compiled as you actually experience it. So like a game is only chunks of media. So this is Archive in Your Pocket from 2014 up at Bristol Zoo. It was about engaging with an audience, with content, and getting them to then respond to that with their own user-generated content, which was shared. So the premise that we start with is the role that the audience takes has evolved to accommodate new forms of technology and changing societal forces. That you have to realize that technology gets used to enforce certain norms. So what do we mean by the role of the audience? So it's the way the audience is framed by the story or their response to the content, or a combination of both. So in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, there's a frame story that contains the individual tales about the journey. Maybe it conveyed by a narrator or guide. So Dylan Thomas is under Milkwood. Listen, and you will hear. You are commanded as the listener. It maybe outlines a set of instructions, like a computer game. Crowther and Wood's Adventures, the original text adventure. It starts off with a description of where you are and what sort of things you can type into it. Or it may emerge as a cultural phenomenon. So Rocky Horror Picture Show, there was no artistic intent to have people in cinemas acting out roles and dressing up. It came about spontaneously in midnight showings in New York or somewhere like that, and people would turn up. Or, and this is one to hang on to, it may be well understood as societal framing. So in the crime novel, the frame story is not contained within the novel. The frame story is out external to it. You expect a crime novel to take a particular form. That frame story exists outside of it. There's actually people who've written sets of rules about crime novels, which includes things like no twins, because that's not fair on... They were known as puzzle books, by the way. What do we mean by the impact of technology? Well, technology changes the relationship between the audience and the creator or storyteller. Writing is a technology. I'll come back to that. Printing, mass production of texts. Lighting, I'll come back to that one as well. Radio, early 1920s. Television, I'll skip television, but it's a bit like radio in those terms. And then AR, 360 video, VR, and interactive media. And I'll focus on interactive media because that was our original problem, but similar issues exist with the others. Now, this took me a long time to get my head round. For most of human history, stories were not written down. They had no written form because writing didn't exist. Writing was invented for keeping accounts. It got co-opted for telling stories later. Stories were not learned verbatim, but there were stock phrases and things that allowed mnemonics, that allowed the storyteller to follow particular patterns or particular rhythms. They're often sung. Oh, and by the way, early stories may well have been signed rather than spoken, because the earliest human language was quite possibly a sign language, or at least a sign and vocalized language before the human voice box developed. So stories would be based around sets of characters and events, and those would then be told differently each time by the storyteller. There are a few traditional storytellers still practicing, obviously within a literate society, but Shona Lee, who's from the Druitsa tradition, which is a Jewish tradition that comes from the Low Countries, possibly the last, I experienced a 2-day storytelling. Not 2 hours, 2 days. I fidget in a film after about 30 minutes. My other half will poke me, stop moving around. I was transfixed for a whole weekend. It's entirely different from the experience of somebody reading a story or recalling it verbatim. So writing is technology that impacted storytelling. It changes the form. In order for the reader to see themselves in context of the narrative of the story, the writers create, particularly the early writers, a frame story, which are effectively instructions on how to understand this story. So culturally you're used to oral storytelling, and now you need instructions to think, well, what's this thing on this piece of paper? My source text, our source text, is Walter J. Ong's The Writer's Audience is Always a Fiction. It's a brilliant paper, unfortunately probably behind a paywall. But to quote the quote from it, the writer's audience is always a fiction. The historian, the scholar, or scientist, and the simple letter writer all fictionalize their audience. This is casting them in a made-up role and calling on them to play the role assigned. So it's that you are writing something to an audience that may not exist yet, or certainly aren't with you. You have to fictionalize them. And this is the core. Because then when we're thinking about interactive content, what are we fictionalizing that audience as? As an interactor or a film watcher or what? We were discussing this at the start of the Amplified Publishing work, and it was Mandy Rose, TV producer now, academic at University of the West of England, who turned around and said, that was really interesting, and that was the stimulus for us to go, okay, if we're getting that response from the practitioners and academics, then maybe we'll go and dive, and it's worth having a look. The next text I picked up from Ong was Orality and Literacy. This is the 30th anniversary edition, which has some interesting additions. That's my response to it. It bends your mind around to go, hang on a minute, what we take for granted as normal is a writing culture, is a print culture. What storytelling comes from is an oral culture. And what it allows us then to do, having grasped that, is to say, well, writing is a technology, film is a technology, sound recording is a technology, and treat them all as the same, rather than tending to say, oh, writing is kind of like the original culture, and these other are adaptions. And that's quite useful. Thoroughly recommend both of these if you can get your hands on them. So, let's have a look at some of the frame stories. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. A journey. So, a journey and an oral story told each night at the inn or whatever the place they stayed. So one of the oldest frame stories, movement through space. Actually rather like many video games. They tend to have a spatial layout that you move through. And what you're getting here with Canterbury Tales is a remediation. So the oral storytelling concept packaged in the new writing technology. package. And something we see people go, oh, let's do a 360-degree film, or let's do a television adaptation of Under Milk Wood, which was made for radio, or a film adaptation, or what have you. It's the same kind of process taking place all that time ago. Now, it took another 300 years for the form of the modern novel to emerge. Quite probably, quite a few authors, including Ong, say Jane Austen is quite possibly the person who managed to work out the sort of narrative structures that we get in a modern novel. Interestingly, Jane Austen, not conventionally schooled, being a woman not being sent to, or as a young woman not being sent to schools being taught rhetoric, so is detached from the standard culture that most authors were within. And it's at this point where you start to then get, if you then add compulsory schooling, or schooling being more widespread and compulsory schooling and literacy coming along, you get this standardized form of the novel and the detective story and the detachment of the frame story away from the actual content itself. Things like Dear Reader, the novel as a letter or novel as a diary gradually fade out. I mean, they still exist in Victorian times. Thing to note, if you get an unusual story structure, the frame story will return. One of my favourites is If on a Winter's Night a Traveller by Italo Calvino, written in the second person singular. You are about to sit down and read Italo Calvino's book, If on a Winter's Night a Traveller. That frame story opens the book. So the narrator there guides the reader. You get the same in sort of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and actually in Dylan Thomas's Under Milk Wood. So if it took 300 years for the form of the modern novel to evolve, the BBC's first director of talks had about 3 years. Hilda Matheson, amazing woman, pretty much got things right in a period of about 3 years. So what you've got is the voice entering the home. So she's part of the Bloomsbury set, familiar with Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville West. And all of that group, so has access to lots of really high-quality speakers from her immediate circle and then beyond. And she brings these people into the radio studio to perform talks. You're talking about 15 minutes long, live, because there's no recording at that stage that's usable for radio broadcasts. And so she has to find a way of taking somebody who's used to speaking to a crowd in a lecture theatre form or a church or a pulpit, and getting them to talk to somebody in their home. So what does she do? Well, there's this lovely pamphlet, Suggestions to Speakers, that she wrote within about 2 or 3 years of starting the work. And this lovely line, she gets it. The most experienced speaker will realize that if he has not broadcast before, he is about to undertake something which is quite different from any other form of speaking. That's the key thing. She realizes you have to change what you do. So in terms of writing, write as you would talk to a friend. In terms of tone of voice, the great thing is to remember you're not speaking to a massed meeting. The note of intimacy, as in conversation with a friend, is the note to adopt. So you as the speaker are a friend to the person you're talking to. You've been invited into their home. You can be chucked out with the flick of a switch. So you have to behave as if you're a friend. And that's the thing that within radio, the audience are in their role at home, whatever it is, whether that's sitting quietly or doing housework or flicking through the paper. And you, as the broadcaster, as the speaker, have to adapt to that role. It does change with different types of content, and the modern form of radio has subverted that to some extent by uses of proxy audiences. So a comedy show now has an audience there to laugh for you, as it were. But one of the most notable ones was drama. Hilda Matheson wrote a brilliant book called Broadcast shortly after leaving the BBC. She fell out with Reith quite badly. Her political views didn't go down too well with somebody who's trying to deal with 1930s Britain. Brilliant book, well worth reading. It's available on the internet. Google Books have a scanned copy of it. And me and Maxine were working our way through it because it's a treasure trove of how do you get from, we've never done radio before, to doing successful radio. But this bit, microphones have been slung in theatre wings to enable plays to be heard from an actual theatre. So, well, yeah, come on, let's just broadcast plays. With certain notable exceptions. This procedure is not usually a success, but the notable exceptions are important and significant. And me and Maxine are going, what? These include great plays, which are also great poetry, and conspicuously the plays of Shakespeare. Why does Shakespeare work on radio? He wrote it all those years ago. Hang on a minute, what's going on? At this point, we start web searching, and Dr. Kirsty Sedgman, who's at University of Bristol, who studies audiences, work popped up around behaviour of audiences in theatre. So, recreation of Shakespearean theatre. Thing to note, the audience can see each other. It's daytime. There's no lighting. So the audience are as likely to interact with each other, like, say, a music festival, as they are with what's going on stage. Also, these are the cheap standing area, the pit. More expensive seats. The very expensive seats are over here. You can't actually see the stage from there. For that and other particular reasons, Shakespeare wrote for an audience that was, one, distracted by other things going on, and two, some of them couldn't see the stage or weren't looking. So it's self-describing. So it works on radio because it calls on you to listen. The soliloquies, to be or not to be, that is the question, are delivered in this context as kind of like the guitar solo in the rock concerts. It's the moment the big actor, the famous actor, delivers their piece and grabs everybody's attention. And it has a similar sort of impact on radio. So what changed? Technology, lighting. So once lighting comes along, the performances could be held in the evening, which has advantages in terms of people working during the day and things like that. Particularly now, this is Victorian area, so you've got industrialisation. So now the audience can be plunged into darkness. They can't see each other. They're not distracting each other. Stage could be brightly lit. Oh, and by the way, we've put seats in now to replace the pit. So you've got the stalls rather than the pit. So all of these people are facing the stage, in a seat that you can't turn around. And, oh, by the way, we're putting the prices up. Excludes the working class. There were riots in the early Victorian era, people actually going along to the theatre and screaming and shouting. Protest at the prices going up. This is where Kirsty Sedgman's has a rich vein of research in this. So what happens then is they get people in. The ushers now wander around telling people to keep quiet. Pay attention, keep quiet. This is the new theatre. And plays start to be written that don't acknowledge the audience. So unlike the great soliloquy, which is delivered to the audience, it's about pleading with you. These ignore it. It becomes naturalistic. So the audience members are reduced to passive observers, instructed to keep quiet. And Anton Otard, a French dramatist, described them as peeping toms. So think Victorian, peeping through the net curtains at what the neighbours are up to. That's your role. You're a passive observer, distanced from the performance by the fourth wall. Oh, and you're instructed to suspend belief. Now, this form is then inherited by film and television, largely. The audience are not acknowledged. When was the last time you saw a cinema film that actually turned around and talked to you? Very rare. So film and TV drama retain the fourth wall. The exceptions, well, early film cuts of the film Blade Runner, when they tested it out, bombed with the audience. Nobody understood it. It's like my problem with using object-based media and the audience not understanding it. So they got Harrison Ford to do a voiceover, a narration, which told the audience, which acknowledged your presence. It disappeared once Blade Runner entered the general culture. So again, the frame story detaches into wider culture and everybody knows what a replicant is. But it also continues to appear in comedy. So Mrs. Brown's Boys, not my favourite of programmes, but you have the character Mrs. Brown, and actually the actor will step outside of the character Mrs. Brown and comment on his character. 2 levels of what's called metalepsis, the story referring to itself. Fleabag, more ironic asides to the camera, a sort of conspiratorial aim. It's often used for comedic effect. Woody Allen in Annie Hall with Marshall McLuhan, pulling him out of the queue for the cinema. But it's not used very often. So we retain this fourth wall and this distance. In documentary, almost always uses direct address. Sort of more lecture type, but also the journey is the frame story. Joe Moran, who's written a few books on media, Professor of English and Cultural History at one of the Liverpool universities, took the mick out of this on Twitter. The journey is frame stories. Hello, I'm insert name here. I've always been fascinated by insert whatever topic this program's about, so I'm going on a journey to find out, insert whatever they knew already, but line people up. I think the Mickey has been taken out of this sufficiently for it to start going away, but it became very tiresome. The lecture form, like John Berger's Ways of Seeing, and if you've never watched John Berger's Ways of Seeing, it's brilliant, was delivered as a lecture to the camera, almost in your face style. I mean, this was late 60s, early 70s, I think. The lecture has fallen out of favour, but one that persists is sort of like the cookery programmes, which tends more to the sort of idea of the friend or the visitor in your home. And it took me a while to realise this, but rather brilliantly, Brian Cox's team have co-opted this for Wonders of the Solar System. So he gets out a few bits and pieces, demonstrates in front of you on the sand or on a table, an experiment in physics, turning it almost into a cookery demonstration. It's very intimate, very friendly, and a way of wrapping a more complex subject in a more accessible form. But the clearest place where audience roles are set out is in computer games, because you've got to interact with it, so you've got to know what you're doing. There's often a strong frame story or lengthy introduction which assigns you a role, often big cutscene which gets you into the story and then what you're doing. There tend to be sort of 3 basic forms. First person shoot 'em up. I'm shooting zombies, this is Doom or what have you, where there's a gun in, the only thing you see is a gun and you are first person in there, in the action. Second person text adventure. So the original adventure game starts with you are standing at the end of a road before a small brick building. Around you is a forest. A small stream flows out of the building and down a gully. And then there's instructions on what you can type to move north, south, or what have you. And then there's the third person version where the player controls an on-screen avatar. So Link is your avatar. They are trying to rescue Zelda. Well, maybe, or maybe we'll go and look for crabs on the south coast or what have you. But that you're assigned, you take on that role through an avatar. In this particular case, the aeroplane is the avatar. If you swap to a pilot seat view, then it would be first person. But nobody likes reading instructions. I had this conversation with Tom Aber of University of the West of England. So the opening part of many computer games is actually a training area. So in Zelda Breath of the Wild, you're kept within the plateau whilst you go through various challenges until you get the hang glider, which allows you to actually depart the plateau and join in the rest of the game. So not only a frame story, but a training ground. So what about interactive? If games work, what about interactive narrative? Particularly interactive audio and video. Well, we've established the passive audience of TV and film coming from theatre, sit there, stay quiet, watch this film. By the way, of course, that is a UK cultural specific phenomena and probably a white Anglo-Saxon specific phenomena. Other parts of the world, other cultures, there's much more tendency to be vocal within a film, within a cinema. Versus the games, active, you are controlling, you are being Link, you are controlling Link, you are standing at the by a stream. This leads to a loss of immersion because if you're showing some video or audio and then you say, oh, make a choice, you switch the audience role. And this was the thing that had been noticed quite some time ago. BBC did a couple of interactive radio experiments, one called Spin the Wheel, and about a year later, Dark House. And this was the response by Sue Arnold in The Observer to Dark House. Leave me out of this, I just want to listen. Right? So we knew there was a problem many years ago, 20 years ago. But we had kept making this same sort of stuff. And this is where me and Maxine are going, yeah, we've made this stuff. Now, hang on a minute. This is the response. And in a more recent piece of work that Maxine was involved with, University of Salford did a study of this piece, which is Our World War, BBC 3. So there were 3 linear BBC 3 TV programs and then an interactive version where you are watching this film about this young corporal, I think, whose senior officer has been killed, so has to take over this small platoon or group and try and keep them alive whilst under fire. Every so often the narrative stops and it asks you what you would do at this point in the narrative. The response from one of the subjects in the research was, I kind of had an avatar switch, which was so brilliant they used it as the name of the paper. I kind of had an avatar switch, the role of the self in engagement with interactive TV drama. And what they found was this, you'd be watching, getting into it, and then, oh, it would ask you a question, and then you'd try and think about the answer to the question, and then you get back to it, but by which time you'd lost the immersion in the storytelling. By contrast, this is BBC Click's 1000th anniversary edition, which is interactive. This worked up to a point because he's a presenter, he's talking to you. He's also taking the mick out of Choose Your Own Adventure series. Actually not taking the mick, it was an homage to it because he got one of the original writers in. And he talks to you and it's a dialogue. What shall I do? Keep the hat, return the hat. Oh, by the way, if you're ever making interactive narrative and you do this sort of thing, they had to take the hat all the way around the world because every time he filmed a link, they'd have to film it twice, once with the hat, once without the hat. Something not to do. The other thing was that it ended up being overlong, about 3 hours worth of material, and the response we got from the audience was kind of like the fear of, where am I? I'm a bit lost in this. I mean, if you think about most computer games, they give you a map, show you where you are, show you how many trophies you've won so far. We didn't have any of that, and that was a really big lesson that we learned. So fear of missing out, and are we nearly there yet? Really successful. This was a trailer called Discover Your Demon, which was a trailer for the first series of His Dark Materials, made by BBC Creative, written, most of the writing was done by Emma Nuttall, who's a resident here, who was on placement with me at BBC R&D, who is still in the process of writing up the PhD. It takes the form of a personality test, but as a narrative form. And this is back to the sort of adventure games, choose your own adventure. You're given a role, you're sort of Lara really, and you're making decisions at each point, which way to go. So, clearly assigned role, and like a personality test, you have an outcome, which is which demon you're assigned. Emma actually leaned on the structural, the monster structures in Dungeons and Dragons to get the categorization. And then you can play it again. And quite a few people would play it a couple of times and try and get different outcomes and explore the different demons. We had one or two people who got everywhere, went to every possible outcome. So there's a degree of a game, there's a degree of role play. But what we found, and if you know the Stornoway team, who are just across the way, with their interactive toolkit, joining in with their academic group on Zoom the other day, what was most compelling were the role plays, particularly training role plays where you had this jeopardy of, in one case, somebody's had a heart attack, you've got the defibrillator, which button should you press, what should you do next? Very compelling. We've got some internal stuff as well that we've done in the BBC about training radio producers. You've got a recalcitrant producer who's got problems with the sound. Do you call, what's your call? Keep going on the call or drop it and we'll try and get them back on later, and then rinse and repeat. And having worked in local radio stations, it's compelling, as is the one about defibrillation. So strong roles work really well. So to conclude, creating a coherent role for the audience is key to maintaining flow. If you want to disrupt flow, that's fine, but on the whole, maintaining flow is a good idea. New forms of technology change the relationship with the audience. We looked at far more forms of media than are in this talk. And so often, somebody who is expert in one form of media will try and do what they do in that form of media in the new form of media, and it takes a while for people to come along with a fresh point of view and go, no, I know what that's useful for. In the history of film, the first narrative films were produced not by the men who were going out and filming trains and people coming out of factories, but by a secretary who said, hey, I can do stories with this. Unfortunately, she got written out of the history of most of cinema that you'll find. But it's that naive viewpoint is often really useful in exploring new technologies. Remediation, so changing from one media to another, often requires a change in the audience role as well as the content. When people talk about 360-degree media and VR, I will also say, well, why are you talking to writers? Why don't you go and talk to garden designers and architects? Because that's a space you move through that tells you a story. And the interaction needs to provide a consistent role. In fact, thinking about it, actually interaction, if you're going to put interaction into a piece of media, into a story, that interaction needs to support the story, be part of the story, not be something you tack on later as a quiz or something like that, because it's fashionable. So the question for any creator is, and this is the thing that we're now doing with our people who sign up for our Story Kit toolkit, which allows interaction, is, so what role are you casting your audience in? That's almost the first question now, since we've done this piece of work. Because if you're telling a story about dance, and we had the Dance Passion set of pieces recently, so what's the audience relationship to this piece? And that was quite successfully done with a documentary piece about a leading black dancer in the UK. Became more of a dialogue between him and the audience as opposed to a plain, straightforward documentary. So, plug for the paper. There's a lot more to read here. It is, what was it, 80 pages, I think? I think we got to 79. There's rather a lot in it. It started off as a 10-page paper, and then there's a bit more to say. 6 months later, it's 80 pages, and the management has started to ask, isn't that a book? Available online, just search for Role of the Audience in Media. It should throw up the blog post introduction, which covers more or less what I've covered today. And that has a link then to the full white paper. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. Does anyone have any questions? Please stick your hands in the air. We got one. Thank you, Michael.
Thinking about the recent sort of popularity of what they call jukebox musicals on stage.
So,
Jukebox musicals, where they base a play around like the music of one artist, like Queen,
yes.
things like that. And those things, I gather, the audience go along to sing along. But I think there was one recently where I think it might have been The Bodyguard, where they were trying to sort of discourage the audience from singing along because they wanted the singer to be heard and not the audience.
Yes, I think so I think what you've got is two separate concepts there in terms of the theatrical intent. I think it's really there is this: what expectation are you placing on the audience in terms of what you're producing? So. The Sound of Music, for example, as a film, was not designed as a film to sing along to. But like the Rocky Horror Picture Show, it has evolved into, you can go along and see The Sound of Music, or you can go to a sing along with The Sound of Music production, completely, dressed up in all your costumes. They will do rehearsals at the beginning, best costume, the works. So you go from the sort of an evening based around the film The Sound of Music, which is full of audience participation, through to the sort of Queen theatre and the various others around the songs of a band. And I wasn't aware that was sort of sing-along, but then but certainly it's the key thing there is the songs. To what happened in Manchester, about a quarter of a mile away from where I live, where the police got called. And there you had, and this is where I recommend the work of Kirsty Sedgman, in the case of the audience in the theatre, the expectation of the rest of the audience is to be able to hear what's going on stage in conventional theatre. In musicals, there is kind of like two forms, one of which is participatory. Pantomime, your classic, the classic theatre genre, where if everybody sat quiet, it would be a very weird pantomime. Right? Or this is your star singer, and they are performing for you, and you're going to keep quiet so everybody can hear them. And The Bodyguard was very much set up as that. There were actually notices on the door of the theatre saying, within the theatre saying, "Do not sing." Now, some of the press reports blame it on excessive consumption of alcohol in terms of some of the members of the audience who had turned up to enjoy themselves by singing. And then fights break out between the people who want them to keep quiet and in the audience and the theatre staff. And there is a cultural rift going on, which may have quite a bit to do with lockdown, may have something to do with expectations of different forms of theatre, people going along to one form of theatre with expectations that it's the other. But I think it's really, once you realise that the form of theatre that we have where you sit there quietly and applaud politely from time to time is an artificial construct brought about by technology, then you start to see that, well, perhaps actually what you get at a music festival with people wandering in and out, getting their drinks and chatting to their friends whilst the performance is going on, is actually relatively normal. It's just that within a theatre we've boxed it in and have people telling you to keep quiet. Where we go from here, watch this space. Sorry.
Thank you very much for that. It's kind of exactly the same question in lots of ways about, so the suggestion that because of the way that lighting and theatre design has sort of normalised sort of a lack of participation, but obviously we can all point to things which suggest otherwise. And one thing I was thinking about was, an immersive theatre performance where you're given a mask to put on, and that there's like an anonymity, and it's almost like a form of permission. And just wondering if you've got any more good examples of sort of permissions to participate, or...
Well, if you go... Well, okay, so let me deal with the mask first, because not having been to any of those sorts of performances, I'm reading from second-hand academic write-ups. And I think what's interesting is that the mask separates the audience from the actors. So it acts in a way like the fourth wall. Okay, there is giving of permission in terms of the anonymity, but it is a separation between the performer and the audience. Whereas in the Greek theatre, the medieval theatre, there is nothing separating you apart from the stage itself. Sorry, I'm just trying to remember where we were going. Sorry, you were...
And then other permissions, maybe?
Right, so yes, so right. The one that came to mind was Brecht. Brecht and Jimmy Miller, latterly known as Ewan MacColl, and I'm trying desperately to remember the name of his first wife, who's a great dramatist who went on to produce Oh, What a Lovely War. That early political theatre of the sort of early 1900s, particularly around 1920, around the communist takeover in Russia and things like that, you have radical theatre where these groups, like MacColl, are going out and provoking the audience into participating. That's the actual aim, Brecht's aim of getting the audience to think for themselves. It's very much there, and it's very much a rebellion against this. You will sit there and and also a rebellion against the idea of catharsis. So the sort of Greek, very particular Greek play construct, Aristotle, poetics, which is only instructions for how to do a story in one very particular form, despite it being rinsed and repeated across many other forms. Yeah, it's about you being sent away satisfied. Brecht is about sending you away questioning. Now, it's revolutionary. It's about giving you ideas or representing the world in a way that allows you to challenge the norms and the structures. So that pushes, if you like, the theatre outside the boundaries of whatever room it's or space it's taken place in, and out into the wider world. I think very much the participation in some forms of immersive theatre are very tightly bounded. If you then go on to the other extreme, which is Boal's Theatre of the Oppressed, where the story is coming from the audience themselves, and the actors are the means by which these terrible stories, because it were stories of the oppressed, can be told through the actors and presented back to that audience, so that they can see the events that happen to them reflected in some way, shape, or form. And you're talking to, Boal saw most of his contemporaries killed by the fascists, so it was very much about catharsis of the group. Sorry.
We got the online.
Oh, no, oh.
Hi, don't mind me, sat at the back, voice of online today. So Mike, who's joining us from Dundee.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Hi, Mike.
Wants to ask, as advancing technologies enable audiences to not just consume, but create and share their own narratives, much like people creating YouTube gaming videos, what key challenges do you foresee in this evolving landscape?
Challenges to whom? I think is the question. I think my perception is, well, okay, if we look at audiences for mainstream television, there's a drop-off below the age of about 40. We can see lots of different forms of media behavior starting about the age of 40 and going downwards. One of the really strong indicators is use of subtitles. So the younger you get, the more likely you are to use subtitles. Nothing to do with hearing. So media consumption patterns are changing in the younger age group. Media production is changing as well. So direct address, direct storytelling. Direct address, direct storytelling becomes the norm. I mean, if you watch a YouTube video and they're not talking straight into the camera at you, that's quite unusual. Go on, you've got a response.
Yeah, so I think the question to Mike then was challenges when audience members become storytellers themselves.
Yes, it's a challenge to what we might call the established storytellers. Well, we can see a sort of cycle round in that some of these new storytellers who will use different forms of storytelling, say direct address, much more immediacy, jump cuts, you know, all sorts of television techniques which, oh, they're terrible, you can't do that, are normalized. So I think that the challenge really for the established storytellers is to keep up with an audience that has gone the other way and has other expectations and expects to see their own lives reflected in content. And shall we say certain broadcasters who spend their time demonizing that younger age group are just sending them somewhere else. And no longer, you know, as me as the sort of teenager growing up on a farm in the middle of nowhere with radio as my connection to the outside world, I didn't have much choice. Now, there's the internet, there's the whole world of choice. And I think the challenge is, if we say, oh, ITV, BBC, whatever, you're losing audiences, is yes, and how do we reconnect? So there was one more.
Thank you. It's been super, super interesting. I work at The Guardian in user research, so think about audiences a lot. I was wondering if you had seen any kind of traditional news media doing anything kind of interesting with the role of audiences, just, I suppose, fact-based, and obviously there's lots of different kind of technologies and ways of communicating, but I was quite interested, like, have you ever seen people using avatars or like really putting more agency on the audience?
Nothing comes to mind. I think in the realm of news, the line I go for is Greta Thunberg's address to, I forget which particular group of politicians, but we've done our homework, you haven't. And that is that now, when a journalist talks about a climate change document that UN scientists have produced, any 14-year-old can go and read it. And quite a lot of 14-year-olds will understand it very well. And so for the journalist, the challenge is that if you depart from what's in that document, you're found out by that young audience who are hungry for information. And, you know, now with the climate problems we've had in the last 12, 18 months, that disconnect is very strong. And I think that one of the keys that user research we've seen is authenticity. So that thing of, if you clip that piece of video that doesn't show what caused that person to lash out and doesn't show how they were then treated, it looks like they're unprovoked violence. If you actually see what provoked that violence, i.e. it was self-defense, and then the way they were beaten up, and if you look at, I mean, some of the footage of what happened with the Kill the Bill protest in Bristol, which didn't make it into mainstream media, but did circulate widely, and you get this disconnect then. So what you get is news being shared around various social media platforms that is different from what you're seeing in the papers, what you're seeing in the television, what you're hearing on the radio. I don't think I've seen anything. I mean, we have done 360-degree news footage and things like that. There's Congo, brilliant piece of 360-degree footage done with an experienced correspondent who just gets the idea of a 360-degree camera means I'm just talking to that camera and takes you on a journey. It's brilliant. But it's not been sustained in terms of costs and what have you. Oh, and by the way, and we do say, by the way, when they put the 360-degree camera down in the meeting room, in front of the empty seat that's got the camera in is a bottle of drink. Why is it there? It's there to give you a hint as to your role. You're kind of like the person coming along, the trainee. So it gives you a satisfying role within that environment. That, I forget his name, but if you look it up, BBC Congo, he absolutely gets the idea of bringing the storyteller along. If you find if you download the paper, I've got the links in there to it. It's on YouTube. Sorry, you're about to.
I don't. Can you be quick, Michael?
I can be quick.
All right.
Mine's more just like, I just wanted to highlight, obviously, Bandersnatch, that was the Black Mirror episode, was a really good example of interactive kind of TV that's quite a modern thing. Well, it's not modern like today, but sort of fairly modernish a couple of years ago. And that was quite a good example, I think, of the interactive TV. And I think it's probably like these days with like, also with like watch-a-thons, where like I've watched a film and then everyone's messaging on Twitter with, say, the director or something, and then you can ask questions, and the use of modern technologies for, say, film and TV shows where people can watch stuff and message in instantly, that the role of that. I'm interested in the future with like the way things are evolving at the moment.
Yeah, I think two things there. One, that external layer around the media itself has just evolved. Social media, the sharing, watch party, or people, and that's happened for years. There's a piece of research which I've not been able to get my hands on around that's demonstrated it. The other thing with Bandersnatch is, well, what was your role in Bandersnatch? It took me a PhD student who watched every single pathway to come back and say, you're the voice in his head that's driving him mad, because if you don't interact with it, he stays sane. And that's your role in Bandersnatch, and not a lot of people get it. The user testing papers that we found, that you are alienated from this character. Stanley Parable is another good example of that same structure. Follow the narrator in Stanley Parable, and you get the sunshine and the birds and what have you outcome. Every other one, you die a horrible death of some kind or another.
All right, well, I think we'll leave it at that. There we give a round of applause for Michael. Thank you. All right, well, before you all go, if you want to stick around and hot desk or find out more about what we do, please find one member of the studio team who's here. It's just me and Emma here. There's other people, they're just not here right this second. If you're watching online, drop us a line on studio@watershed.co.uk with any questions. Thank you all for being here, and we'll be here to see you again next week.